Welcome to the third edition of Magyar Origins. What is Magyar Origins? It is not another book about the settling of Europe by Hungarians. That is just another step in their history and has nothing to do with their origins. Instead, it is a fresh look at the true origins of not just the Magyars, but all Finno-Ugrian speakers. It re-examines how these people are related and how their cultures formed. In the process, it demonstrates how almost everything you thought you knew about Hungarians is based on myths and racism. Who are the Finno-Ugrians? These are people that include the Finns and the Hungarians. Are their languages related? Absolutely. That is something that's been tested and verified over and over again. You can look at words like louse or water, and they're very similar from one language to the next. Do they share a common origin in Western Siberia? Well, that all depends who you ask. Many linguists will say their research concludes there was a common origin for all Finno-Ugrian speakers somewhere around Western Siberia. But if you ask geneticists, they will say something a little different. Their evidence points away from a common origin, even for closely related linguistic groups. So, if these groups develop their language separately from each other, then a common influencing factor must be considered, instead of a common single source. Is it possible for two or more groups of people to develop similar languages without ever having contact with each other? The answer is not only yes, but it has happened many times before. We call those languages Creole, and they're primarily developed in the 16th and 17th centuries. Creole languages are languages that develop when two groups of people who share no common vocabulary come into contact with each other. In the 16th and 17th century, slavery was the common avenue for this contact. Traditionally, linear development was looked at to find a parent language for Finno-Ugrian. When no common words could be found, the language family was deemed separate and unique. But with Creole languages, because they are learned, not inherited, meanings are often shifted or based on colloquial usage. For example, if we look at Creole words for upset, they did not adopt the English word upset, but rather the English word vexed, which actually means irritated or annoyed. So if we consider something similar to Creole formation for Finno-Ugrian, then the question that arises is who did the Finno-Ugrians have extensive contact with thousands of years ago that could have influenced their language formation? It certainly wasn't the Sumerians, and it couldn't have been the Slavs as their contact came much later. Fortunately, archaeology has already answered this question for us. For the longest time, everyone bought into the idea that the Finno-Ugrians lived in isolation in Western Siberia or the Urals, because that is what linguists said they were doing. But all this has recently changed. Archaeology now takes the position that the Finno-Ugrian zone was also the homeland to the Indo-Iranians, who only later migrated south. And not just to the early Indo-Iranians, but also their later offshoot Indo-Aryans as well, meaning they lived in close proximity to Finno-Ugrians for thousands of years, a perfect environment for language adoption. While linguistics is embracing the notion of primitive Finno-Ugrian who practice shamanism, archaeologists are saying, wait a minute, the Finno-Ugrians are actually worshipping Indo-Aryan gods. So much for the drum-beating shamans that we've been taught to envision when we think of early Hungarians. In light of this new archaeological information, it becomes very apparent that Indo-Aryans were influencing how Finno-Ugrians thought religiously. And this makes sense when you think about it. It has long been accepted that Hungarians borrowed their practice of horse sacrifice from the Indo-Aryans. That was something that left highly visible remains, so linguistics couldn't argue it away. So why not other aspects of their religion? And this influence was not just on religious views. Colloquial terms also seem to have worked their way into the core of the language. The Hungarian word for breast, though, took a different evolution. There is no equivalent Indo-Aryan word for breast because the Hungarian word for breast evolved from the Hungarian word for beside, as in two objects beside each other. Once we recognize this, then the Indo-Aryan root becomes obvious. So treating Finno-Ugrian like Creole languages and accepting a high level of Indo-Aryan contact, what happens when we compare them to Sanskrit? What happens is that we find the entire Finno-Ugrian vocabulary, not just common trade words, demonstrating that Finnish and Hungarian are more closely related to Sanskrit than they are to each other. For example, traditional comparisons for the word for hand demonstrate no relationship between Hungarian and Sanskrit, simply because they fail to consider the meaning changes from other Sanskrit words for hand. But when we look at the Hungarian word for in Sanskrit, we find that it in fact carries a similar meaning in both languages. The entire core of the Finno-Ugrian vocabulary can be reconstructed in this way. So what about all those Slavic words linguistics claim the Finno-Ugrians borrowed? Early linguists claimed Finno-Ugrian, especially Hungarian, was defective, so primitive it needed to borrow words for almost everything they encountered in Europe. This was clearly based on racism, Let's look at the word hur, for example. Linguists claim the Hungarians borrowed the word kurva from the Slavs. So driven was their need to show how Hungarians owed everything to Europeans, they failed to consider other possibilities. One being that Hungarians knew about hurs before they even got to Europe. When Sanskrit is examined, the Hungarian word for hur is obviously Indo-Aryan in origin. The fact the Slavs use the same word unchanged in every Slavic language suggests they loaned the word from Hungarian and not the other way around. Another example is the Hungarian name Shandor, pronounced with an SH, not Sandor. Linguists were in such a frenzy to label everything alone in Hungarian. They took one look at Shandor and said it must be a variant of Alexander, just another word Hungarians borrowed. But in this process, they failed to notice that the Roma have the exact same name in their language. Now, the linguists looked at the Roma language, and they had already decided these people were speaking Indo-Aryan language, so it was not hard for them to say the Roma name Shandor is Indo-Aryan in origin, related to similar names in Hindi and Urdu. In fact, when we look at the name Shandor in Indo-Aryan languages, we see that it's fairly common, and none of them are claiming to have loaned it from the name Alexander. So, here we have two completely different etymologies for the exact same word based solely on what race the linguists were looking at. Yes, it could be a false comparison, and these two words share exactly the same meaning purely by coincidence. But when archaeologists are saying Finno-Ugrians were living side by side with the Indo-Aryans, isn't it more likely that the names share a common origin, and linguistics has just been making it up as they go along? Want to know more? Check out the latest edition of my book, now available on Amazon.